Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about a topic that was suggested to me by a coworker, or I should say, by someone who's working at one of the companies I'm currently contracting at. And he asked, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the ever expanding team size on projects and the impact that has on the process of making games. And that's a good question because I've been doing this a long time and teams are steadily getting bigger. They don't always get bigger. I've gone from some bigger teams to some smaller ones, but in general, games are taking more and more people to make. So I thought I'd talk about that. Let me give you a quick background. So I've made games with teams as small as 3 or 4 people, and by team I'm talking about the actual people who are working together to make it, and not the people who come in later to maybe like if you contract out some art or you contract out the localization or someone comes in to make your box cover or something like that. I'm not necessarily talking about that because those are often in the past and now frequently things that are sent out for someone to do. I'm talking about what you would call as the in-house development team. So I've worked on ones that are as small as 3 or 4 people, and I've worked on big ones that are almost 200 people. Usually it's around 50 to 70. It probably averaged in the 90s, in the high teens to 30s, and then starting in the 2000s got bigger, and by the 2010s were regularly about 50 to 60 people, if not 70 to 80. So, as usual, when I answer questions like this, I don't have a definitive answer, but I can tell you that there are a lot of pros and cons to big teams. So let me just talk about it in terms of let's talk about all the good things about being on a big team and all the bad things about being on a big team, because small teams are pretty much the opposite of all that. So the advantage of having a big team is you get to make a big game. That sounds relatively straightforward, but there are some games that you just really can't do with a small team. It's hard to make a really long and involved RPG with modern art and the level that people expect of how many hours it would be and how many characters there are and how many different places you can go and how detailed it looks and how many items there are. It's hard to make that with a small group. MMOs are another example of a really specific genre that needs a lot of people because it has everything. You have to make the game itself. There's networking involved. There's data servers. There's the security. There's all the service stuff that comes with it for people doing subscription or wanting to change accounts, and just the fact that MMOs tend to be large. Similarly, for gas games, games as a service, gas, those require a lot of people who are considered to be on the team because they're in the trenches every day, but because your game has a live component, this thing has to be maintained. Large teams also let you have specialists. When I was in the 80s and 90s, I learned how to wear many hats at once: producer, designer, programmer. Things that have changed as over time and as teams have gotten bigger, you end up specialists. You may have a programmer who just does lighting or just writes pixel shaders, or you may have an artist who just all they do is light levels. They don't actually make any of the props in the level, they don't actually put the level together, but they light it. And if you get people who are really good specialists like that, you can have some absolutely gorgeous looking games and some fantastic features. Things like gunplay. There are designers who specialize in how guns feel and reload and animate and fire and how reactions happen to it. This is a big deal. These are people that pay attention to the frame by frame of what goes on when you're doing gunfights. Writing is something that's been specialized. It used to be people on the team just did the writing in addition to whatever else they were doing. And then we started getting narrative designers. And now we have people who are specifically good at writing dialogue, and people who are good at writing lore, and people who are good at writing the scripts for a cinematic. There's just, or for ads, and there's so many different ways that people can become good within the within the overall narrative design field. Also, as teams get bigger, you end up with a community manager that's just for you, who can handle posts and questions that come in, can handle your forums, and they're just on your game, and that's something that's incredibly fun and great to have, especially when you're doing conventions and you're going to do a roundtable. If you have a dedicated community manager, he or she can tell you these are the kind of questions people have been asking. These are the kind of questions you might expect to get if we open up to a Q&A. Those are really good to have. There's a phrase, more hands make less work. I think it's Canadian. I don't know. I think I may have seen it on Letterkenny. But what that means is when you spread out a lot of work, it can get done faster and better. Really difficult tasks can be broken down so multiple people can work on them. Also, things that are considered drudgery. I don't want to give specifics, because some people really like some of the work like that. But there's a lot of parts of a game that many people consider to be drudgery work. Spreading that out among additional people is a lifesaver, because then no one person is stuck doing all of that work. And then the final one that I could think of as a pro to having a big team, in theory, you can get a game out faster. Sometimes you have a big team because you're making such a big game, you had to have a big team. But I know in companies that are trying to get games out for a console cycle, because consoles are only out there for about 8 to 10 years, and then they come up with a new one. That's, if games take 3 or 4 years, that's a window you have to get games out. So a lot of companies like to have big teams, and then they stagger production so that you always have a pre-production team that's ready to start a new game once the old game gets past that phase, and you have prop artists that are ready to make art for your game, concept artists that are ready to do all the concept for all the different art you're going to need for the game. They're ready to go in stages so you can get games out faster. And that's something that's probably only true for when you have big teams. You can often stage them on different games as those games need more or less people in different stages, because the early pre-production stage is very different than the production stage, which is very different than the fixing the bugs and optimization stage at the very end. Usually, you need concept artists at the very beginning, lots of artists in the middle. You don't need a lot of artists at the end, because usually all that's done. So that's the good example of how you can shift people around to other projects. And when you have a lot of people, you can fill up all those phases. So those are the advantages of having a big team. Let's talk about the disadvantages. There's a lot of communication overhead needed when you have a big team. You need to track and sync a lot of work. So bigger games mean more meetings, more emails, more documentation, larger databases of tasks and bugs. This is just the nature of the beast. Communication overhead goes up. I believe it's exponential with the number of people. So the difference between a 10-person team and a 30-person team and a 100-person team, the communication overhead is huge. It goes up much bigger than just the size of the team. Keeping all those parts moving is a lot harder. When there's just a few people, it's easy to keep everybody busy. Everyone's getting tasks, taking them in at the rate they're working. You can see where there's any bottlenecks. But to keep all those parts moving when there's 100 people, 200 people, that's a lot of work. That means you need more producers, because you need more production to handle all the team members that are doing work, all the data that has to be tracked, all the parts of the game that need to be estimated and bug tracked and localized. Somebody's got to do that and keep that moving. That means you have more production. Production members, and I'm not saying this as to belittle what they're doing, they're not actually making the game. They're letting all of us be able to make the game. So production's needed, but as you have more people, you need more production, and those production people aren't generating content for the game. I've noticed that when teams get bigger, it leads to a less familiarity between team members. And I think that's just human. It's hard to keep, you can be friends with 2 or 3 people. You can be loose friends with 20 or 30 people, but once it gets over 50 people, there are going to be people on this team that you literally don't know. You don't know who they are. You don't know what they do. And I've noticed that leads to misunderstandings when people thought somebody was working on something and they weren't, or they were supposed to do it a certain way and they weren't. It can also lead to mistrust. You may think someone's not working hard because their particular job involves a lot of thinking. So you see them sitting at their desk a lot like this, and it doesn't look like they're doing anything. So I've seen mistrust grow in bigger teams. Probably the biggest problem that I see in big teams, though, is tiny little mistakes can get magnified into really big problems. Here's some examples. Let's say you've done a bunch of scripts on your game, and that's kind of like code that's handled as data that non-programmers can write. If you have a small game and there's a problem with the script interpreter, so you need to redo your scripts. Maybe they need something added to the top. Maybe they need flags put on them. And you need to redo all the scripts. In a small game, you can do that in a day. In a big game, that may take a month. And it may take a few people working that month. It becomes a big problem. Similarly, let's say you're making a game and all of a sudden, publisher, the admin above you, whoever's giving you money, says, oh, we need to add a new language. It needs to be done in this other language as well. Hey, if you have a small game, you may have 10,000 words, 20,000 words. No biggie. A big game? That may have 500,000 to 1,000,000 words. Adding a new language is a huge, huge deal. It also depends on what the language is. Some languages are easier to translate into because you don't need a new font added to the game, so you don't need to pull in more people. By the way, that may be a specialist person. You also have to worry because some languages, genderize nouns, especially if you're doing generated dialogue like I did on Arcanum, and I have a video about that. Some languages have honorifics, so you need to record the stations of the social class of the NPCs because the dialogue will get written differently. And the person doing the localization may have a question beyond just, is this a man talking or a woman talking? They may need to know, is this a shop clerk talking? Is this a noble person that's being addressed? Because that will change how they localize those dialogues. Similarly, let's say you make a misestimate in how long it's going to take to make some part of the game. In a small game, that may cost you $10,000, maybe $50,000. But that may seem like a lot of money, but in the huge scope of making a game, it's not. However, in a big game, a small 10% estimate may mean you're off by $1 million or $10 million. And suddenly you're talking about a lot of money. And that money's got to come from somewhere. And we're not even talking crunch. We're talking a 10% misestimate was applied to some portion of the game. This is a big deal. I've heard of games that have had 500, 1,000, 2,000 people on them. And not all at the same location. Spread out around the country, spread out around the world. I'm working as a contractor now on with a distributed team that are literally all over the planet. They're all over the US, they're all over Europe, they're in Asia and Australia as well. So just finding a time to have a meeting with that group can be difficult. Part of the fact that I wake up at 5 in the morning, so I've said, oh yeah, I can be available at 6 or 7 a.m. for a meeting, has come into play sometimes. They've said, we're going to take you up on that. I had a meeting at 7:15 the other day. That's fine with me. So I think I've run over most of the pros and cons I could think of for team size. So let me just say this. If I had my druthers, if I had to pick, it's like if someone gave me a bag of money and said, make whatever game you want, I would rather use a smaller team over a longer period of time. Because you get all the advantages of that small team without a lot of the cons of the bigger team. And the longer time means you can maybe make bigger scoped games than you otherwise could. I do understand, though, because I've encountered in the past, that sometimes you just need a big team. So they're not always avoidable. I'd say for introverts, smaller teams are nice because you just have less communication overhead. But I've seen people get into areas on big teams where they themselves don't need a lot of interaction. So there's room for everyone on every team. But I hope this gives you some insight into how team size can affect game scope and game management.